Hey, everyone, and welcome to episode 12 of the Economic Forces Podcast. I'm Brian Albrecht of the International Center for Law and Economics, and as always, I'm joined by Josh Hendrickson, who's at Ole Miss. This podcast is meant to supplement our weekly newsletter, which you can find at pricetheory.substack.com. We're going to switch things up today. Instead of doing our normal interview, oral history type of thing, which have been great. You guys should check those out. Josh and I are just going to have a little conversation. We're going to talk a little bit about what is price theory. It's a question we get all the time. We emphasize price theory. Kind of what is it? What do we mean by that term? It's going to be a little back and forth, super casual, just kind of flesh out some of the ideas that we think are central. We both wrote down a few different things to kind of guide our conversation, but we'll see kind of where things go. Any other thoughts before we get going, Josh?
I think this is just a good opportunity to kind of dig into what exactly we mean by price theory and what are the kind of things that, if you're doing price theory, you might focus on and why that approach gives you sort of good insights into what's going on and to better understand the world.
Yeah. So we'll try to cover both the, what's different, but then also why we think that that's valuable. Because I think it's fair to say we've been very conscious with using that term. We may not know what it means exactly, and we'll see if we maybe come to an incoherent explanation during this conversation, but we don't just say economics, right? We're trying to differentiate a little bit. Some of it is maybe artificial product differentiation, but some of it I think is substantive. I think that there is a difference between what we're trying to push, what our newsletter is trying to argue, and the way of thinking that we're trying to, put forward versus, I don't know, print Mancu's textbook or some other relevant comparable.
I guess the first thing that I wrote down that we could talk about is that, to me, one of the things that kind of makes price theory unique is that price theory has this sort of emphasis on exchange, right? This emphasis on buyers and sellers. How are they sort of coordinating on a price? These sorts of things. And I think that focus on exchange really helps you to think a little bit differently about what's going on in markets. And it forces you to kind of come up with, ways of understanding things that you might not understand otherwise. It also gives you different perspectives on things like, transaction costs and things like that. And I also think that's kind of why the sort of people who are identified with the UCLA approach are also tend to be the same people who are associated with like sort of Coasian reasoning and things like that.
So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that connection between exchange and what exchange is different. How is that different than a standard textbook, right? And in a standard textbook, you draw a demand curve, you draw a supply curve. They're exchanging, right?
Yeah, so the way that I think about it is there's two kind of ways that you think about like disequilibrium in the context of supply and demand. So one way is just to say, oh, there's excess supply, right? And so there's this excess supply, and so producers have too much stuff to sell, and the people who want to buy it, they're not willing to buy what the producers have sold. And so how are we going to get to an equilibrium? And then you kind of talk about, well, the sellers want to sell their stuff, so they're going to start lowering prices until they attract enough customers to buy their stuff. And I think that's a perfectly coherent story. But I think a lot of times, like in price theory, you take a different approach. And instead of focusing on disequilibrium prices, you kind of focus on disequilibrium quantities. Like suppose that there's this amount of this good to be traded, right? What's the marginal buyer willing to pay? What's the marginal seller? What's it cost the marginal seller to produce it, right? And and if buyers are willing to pay a price that's higher than the cost of producing it, then there's gains from trade to be had. And then that kind of leads you into these other questions, because it's possible that those gains from trade appear as though that they're there, but then they're not. But there's no trade that takes place or something like that. And so then the question is, why is that? What's preventing the trade from taking place? And it forces you to kind of think about, okay, what constraints am I ignoring? What costs am I ignoring here, right? So maybe what I'm saying is the marginal cost to the seller is actually, just one aspect of cost, right? Maybe there's some other cost that's going on here.
Let's step back for a second. I think that's right, and that's be a nice connection to the transactions cost. But you said something earlier that and maybe seemed kind of an artificial distinction between price and quantity. But I think the thing that ties it together is this emphasis on gains from trade, right? And not just, oh, people are sitting around, they have excess supply. Oh, shoot, I have excess supply. I guess I got to lower the price. No, it's like what does it mean to have excess supply? It means that somewhere out there's a gain from trade to be had that wasn't taken advantage of. I didn't lower the price enough. I raised it too much. I did this or that. That there's something behind there's ties it to this emphasis on rational action and decision making. Someone's trying to find value out in the world, okay, and that's what's driving behavior, not this kind of passive, oh, price is there, I'm reacting to it. And I think that shows up in I have a newsletter called Markets Must Become Competitive, and it starts from this point in Elcha and Allen that there aren't markets that just exist. There are trades that people want to make, right? That's where we start. People have purposes, people have preferences. They're trying to make things better, and out of this becomes prices, versus the other framework is there are prices and then people respond. I've said it in a few different newsletters, but I think that's a kind of important distinction. It's the action that comes first, and then we can start thinking of, okay, what's hindering, in the second part of your statement, what's hindering that? Hindering might be too normative. Why isn't that pursuit of gains from trade playing out as maybe we would have expected when we just draw the curves?
Yeah, and I think that especially if you look at sort of like UCLA versions of price theory, I think you see like two aspects to it, right? Like, so you have this one aspect where there's this really big emphasis on transaction costs. Well, why do you care about transaction costs? Well, because you're thinking about gains from trade, and you're trying to think about anything that drives a wedge between those gains from trade. But then I also think like that something that doesn't get as much attention is like this literature with people like Ostroy and where they're actually focused on like where do prices come from, right? So in supply and demand, prices are just sort of coming from these interactions between buyers and sellers, but we don't really stipulate the process that determines those prices. We kind of use, appeals to gains from trade or appeals to, excess demand or excess supply. And we can kind of tell an intuitive story about why prices would adjust. But then you have this whole literature that's like, well, let's actually figure out where these prices come from, right? And how do we get to that particular price? How do we find the price that's going to coordinate this behavior?
Yeah. And I think this was something we may come back to later that also brings in the importance of money and why you have this connection between, Elchin wrote on money, Friedman, wrote a price theory textbook, wrote on money, obviously, that money is going to be an important part of that because it's something that facilitates this discovering of prices, this discovering of gains from trade. So then, okay, transactions costs are there as well. How does this tie to the Coase theorem? You brought that up a little bit ago.
Yeah, so I think to me, like the problems that Coase is describing, when he introduces the Coase theorem, is really taking this idea of thinking about everything as just, exchange. And taking it down to like, the bare bones level. Like, let's think of very specific examples where we've got like one person who wants, a particular outcome and one person who wants a different outcome. And so how do we, like what is the outcome that's going to emerge? And to me, that's what the Coase theorem is entirely about, is that if you're in a world of transaction costs, then kind of like the things like the rules of the game of society are going to matter, right? Who has the property rights, and are are the property rights well defined? All of those sorts of things start to matter. But to me, really, like the whole argument that sort of surrounds the Coase theorem is really about thinking very carefully about the nature of exchange and what is important in the process of exchange, and how do we get to a particular outcome, and what are the impediments to that outcome. And also it kind of refocuses your attention on transaction costs, because I think like a lot of people see transaction costs as this impediment to like Pareto efficiency or something like that. But like transaction costs are like an impediment if we start from the idea that like there's this frictionless world that we live in where there are no transaction costs and there's this ideal outcome. And I think like the Coase theorem makes you flip that around and say, okay, actually like transaction costs matter because they can potentially prevent these gains from trade from taking place. And so, when we think about allocations and when we think about policy, what we're really thinking about are like, what's going to reduce transaction costs and things of that nature. But also, like, to get back to the Alshin point, it also gets you to this point where you realize that, not all transaction costs are sort of wasteful, right? There's a lot of specialization there that matters. There's a lot of things that, if we compare to an idealized world, it looks like transaction costs are an impediment, but if we actually compare the relevant counterfactual, transaction costs would be even higher without these like specialist middlemen and people like that.
Yeah, I think it's important on the Coase theorem point to separate out the Stigler interpretation, which is everything will be efficient if you just let people bargain. I think that's a useful framework to work through. That trade is more general than just apples and oranges. We can trade, everything's an exchange of property rights. That means we could trade property rights to noise and things like that. So that's one interpretation, and I think it's helpful to search out, where are these things happening? But then you've been stressing kind of the more Coase interpretation of the Coase theorem, which is, what matters is we live in a world with transactions costs, and therefore things like property rights matter, things like reputation matter, things that other people would call frictions. And I get why we call them frictions. I use the term frictions regularly, but these things matter and we need to take them seriously into account. And I think there's both lenses I find useful at different points. I don't think I have a coherent argument for why sometimes I take the more Stigler approach, sometimes I take the more Coase approach, but I think there's a reason that both of them grow out of price theory. They grow out of the same, for all their differences, they grow out of they don't grow out of De Bruyne, they don't grow out of Arrow, right? They grow out of a Stigler approach to modeling politics, a Coase approach to looking at history, that has some shared, I don't know what it is exactly, and that's what part of this conversation is, but there seems to be some coherent connect between the two.
And I think I think that this is like just a broader point that people who are brought up in like a price theoretic tradition, I think this is just the way that they think. It's like David Laidler, for example, when he talks about monetary economics, he makes a lot of these same points where he's just like, okay, look, you can use, say, like the real business cycle model as a benchmark model, but you have to be careful to recognize that like using that as a benchmark model, that's like an idealized version of the world, right? Like that's, okay, if we got rid of all of the frictions in the world, what would it look like? And his point is that it's fine to use that as a baseline model or a benchmark model, but if you're using that as a point of comparison for thinking about things like money, well, it's going to make it look like money makes people worse off, because all the reasons why money exists would be considered frictions in that model, right? And so you're going to look at that and you're going to think, well, the money is a disaster. And his point is like, well, but then why would money have emerged in the first place, right?
Yeah.
If it was creating costs. And his point is like, no, the relevant counterfactual is thinking about the world without money, which would
Yeah.
not look like the real business cycle model. It would, it would have even bigger transaction costs.
Yeah. 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 So that's are you comparing it to the real business cycle, full general equilibrium, or are you imagining a world in which money is what is necessary, but then we somehow ban it or something like that? And I think you brought up Ostroy. It wasn't me this time. That's good. You brought up Ostroy, right? This is why we have Ostroy coming out of UCLA in 1974. In addition to his later general equilibrium, competitive equilibrium stuff, like this is in the air. This is part of the discussion. We want to take money seriously. Yes, other, Han tried to incorporate money in some of the other GE people. Maybe I'm mixing up who it was exactly, but like, no, it's Ostroy is the first kind of search model, not the first search model, but one that people point back to. That's coming out of UCLA. I think that's obviously an important connection. So emphasis on exchange. I'll my first one, just to kind of keep things moving, talk about something slightly different. What I keep coming back to is, and this is something that Kevin Murphy in his lectures talk about. The Chicago Price Theory textbook mentions it, but I think this emphasis on competition. Okay, that it's not just, and this can build off of the emphasis of exchange. It's not just you and I exchanging, although that's sometimes important to model and to think about, but that there's competition for each exchange, right? And it's not just happening in isolation. There are, different people that are going to be offering different prices, offering different terms of trade, offering different deals. And that's an important thing to understand when thinking about the world, that, I just bought a house. Yes, the seller is important in that transaction, but the other buyers are critical to determining the price, determining what trades I'm going to get. And when we look around, that's kind of everywhere, right? That everywhere we look, there's competition. It might not always be the textbook example of perfect competition. We can meaningfully say there's differences of degrees, right? Me playing basketball against my 3-year-old is less competitive in an important sense than, I played against someone who's more than 3 feet tall. But the ones that we're often worried about, the markets we actually are in, there's competition, and that's important. Even if you're a monopolist, right? We kind of have a newsletter. I forget which one this was. Yes, we think of the monopolists in isolation, that they're facing this demand curve, but that demand curve depends on, we're just ignoring it. That depends on what other people are doing. It depends on other people's prices. And when we're solving the full model, when we're thinking about the overall outcomes, we need to take that into consideration, right? If I set a monopoly price, I'm making some profits, and maybe that's great. Maybe that's a great explanation of what's happening. But then the next step is going to be, okay, what competition evolves to respond to that? Is there going to be competition between the buyers trying to collude against me? Is there going to be entry? What is going to happen? Where are other people going to come from? And competition is all over the place, I think.
And I think this is one thing where a price theoretic approach differs from like a standard micro approach. Because if you look at textbooks, everything in a standard micro textbook is organized around like the structure of the market, right? Like, is this perfect competition? Is this monopoly? Is this oligopoly? Is this monopolistic competition? And that's all about sort of like the level of competition, and the level of competition somehow being important. And I think that the alternative, like the sort of Alshin and Allen approach of saying, okay, actually you have sort of like price takers, and then you've got price searchers, right? And so you've got some firms who are going to set their own prices, and you've got some firms who don't really have any control over their own price. But it's something about the good that they're selling that determines the degree of control over the price. But you can have competition in either one of those scenarios, and sort of the market structure is kind of it's not independent of that, right? So I mean, if you're selling a homogeneous good, you're going to tend to be in a pretty competitive market. But so it's not independent of market structure, but it's unique from market structure.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and that we can think about those things, and we can actually use what we call the monopoly model to think about price setting behavior, even when the firm is not a monopoly. And then we can
Mhm.
actually think about competition in the context of that model. Like, what would competition do in this model if somebody comes along and they're producing a similar good? What happens to my costs? What happens to
Yeah.
the demand for my product? And I think that's a really important distinction.
Hmm. Yeah, and so it's not the market structure is not independent, but it is endogenous, and this is it responds to these other things. Some of them technological, some of them related to the nature of transactions costs. To circle back, right? If there's physical search costs, that's an attribute, and it's going to affect the pricing strategy and the market structure in equilibrium. Uh, they don't fall from the sky. Maybe that's this ties back to a point I had, we brought up before, is one of the things, especially dem sets is the classic example of this, is okay, where everyone else is taking this thing as given, the market structure. This just it falls from the sky that you're the monopolist. It falls from the sky that you're selling corn and it's competitive. But we need to dig into that and see, what's actually let's go one step deeper, what's causing that. And so Demsets did this in his destruction of structure conduct performance regime of like, okay, there's something else that is affecting, that's ultimately what's driving that. Maybe it's transactions cost, maybe it's technology, maybe it's we can categorize it different ways, but let's not we can start the conversation there. We can start the conversation at the monopoly. I draw monopoly all the time when I taught, especially comparative economic systems. I drew monopoly all the time, but we can go a step deeper, and with that, we can think about competition. So I think that's something that shows up. The simple way we see that it shows up is just this emphasis on kind of supply and demand, which incorporates a particular type of competition, but it shows up more generally, right? People are competing on. Let's take Ben Klein's work on private money. Okay, in that work, Friedman thought that there couldn't exist private money, or that it would have this kind of spillover effect. You can explain exactly his argument better than I could, but my recollection of Klein's response in his dissertation is, well, people can compete not on necessarily like the nominal number, because that's kind of weird. What is printed on the bill. It's kind of a weird thing to compete on. You're not competing on price in the same way. They compete on reputation, and they compete on a commitment to not inflate away. And now, once you have a reputation, which ties to other Elchin and Klein and Crawford, once you have a reputation, and that's the thing you're competing on, different things, if we can roll out the model different ways, we can find different things in the world to stress.
Well, I think this point is important because the emphasis on competition forces you to think carefully about competition, right? So one of the reasons I don't like tying sort of price determination to market structure is that it seems to kind of imply that the one thing that you compete on is price.
Mm-hmm.
But you actually compete on a variety of different margins. And so if you're competing on a variety of different margins, then this is actually important to think about those different implications. So if you're competing on different margins, how does this affect the allocation of resources? How does this affect your costs? How does this affect the demand for your product? Like, all of these things start to matter in ways that just exclusive focus on price is not going to get to. And I don't want to get sort of ahead of ourselves, but like, I also think this ties into the second thing that I wrote down, which is that all costs are opportunity costs. But I think that this is an important point, because a lot of times when we are so as economists, what we're focused on are opportunity costs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's this big emphasis on opportunity costs. And so if I'm trying to develop a reputation um, some amount of me trying to develop a reputation is going to result in certain accounting costs, right? Like
Hmm.
I'll buy advertising or whatever. Um, but some of it's just going to be opportunity costs. Like some of it
Hmm.
is I'm going to take actions that signal that I am, trustworthy or something like that. And there might not be actually like an accounting cost, but there's
Hmm.
an opportunity cost associated with that. And so if we're thinking about that level of competition in the market, that focus on opportunity cost is significant. And it's also significant when we try to do empirical analysis, because if we're just trying
Hmm.
to measure markups and things like that, what we as economists care about are opportunity costs, and opportunity costs aren't always accounting costs. And
Yeah.
so if you're trying to measure markups, the only way that we can measure costs really is through like accounting costs. And so we're sort of ignoring one element of costs in that
Hmm.
kind of approach.
Yeah, it's one of those things that, every textbook starts off with cost or opportunity, or when they introduce cost, they talk about opportunity cost. So it's not really unique in that sense. But I think kind of a commitment to it, maybe not unique, but it's definitely a feature of price theory, UCLA price theory in particular, right? This let's take it seriously, opportunity cost. Let's really kind of flesh it out as much as we can. Sometimes it leads to frustrating things, like we can't measure it as well as we would like. We can measure if we have, accounting norms, and we think that the firms are honest. We can go to their books and we can look at that stuff. That's great. And it's frustrating to just put up your hands and say opportunity costs. But if you just, if you start lecture one, all costs are opportunity costs, and then lecture two is, well, actually, we're only going to look at accounting costs. There's a disconnect there, and I think we need to, at least grapple with it. I don't have answers. It's a thorny thing that's gone back 100+ years, trying to really flesh out what opportunity cost means. But I think you see it again and again,
Well, I think it's
rear its head more. Yeah, yeah.
a commitment to opportunity costs throughout, say, like textbook,
Mm.
because like you said, every textbook will say things like, oh, opportunity cost, that's what here's what you need to know, this is what's really
Mm.
important, opportunity cost is the relevant measure of costs. But then you get to the chapter on like cost curves, and what are they talking about? They're talking about, oh, well, you're going to hire these workers and you're going to pay them this wage. Well, that is an accounting cost, right? Because
Yeah.
hiring those workers, I could have used my resources for something else. But it's also very easy to start thinking about costs entirely in terms of accounting costs, because you're like, oh,
Mm.
I'm hiring workers, I'm buying machines, and like these are very clear accounting costs,
Yeah.
right? And a lot of those things, like if you see discussions of advertising or something in a principles book, it's in like one of those boxes that most of your students ignore, right? And it's like, oh, here's a neat thing about advertising that you might not have thought about, but no student ever thinks about it because they never read that little box. They,
Yeah.
and and
It's got
and
it's got
also,
cute
yeah,
colors, so I
that's
I
right,
don't know why they don't read it.
yeah,
It's pink instead of the white background, but
that's
I
right.
guess. But I think this shows up. You know, yes, it's this opportunity cost is this vague, amorphous thing, but you know, even extending things like, you have a like the Klein Crawford Alchin type of framework, that you have some asset. It's not actually on the books, but an asset that is your reputation. Okay. It's not on the accounting books. There's no line on the accounting books for reputation. There's things like advertising that could relate to it. But we're going to write down a model where there is a value to that. And yes, we can't map it perfectly to the accounting books, but at least there is a cost. Now when I'm deciding, do I cheat today versus do I maintain quality, or at least writing it down and forcing us to, like, there is something that is not going to show up in the books, and then you generate, I think, insights that are things like, once we take this into account, that's bad. Once we actually consider this, now it could be perfectly feasible that in the long run, prices are above accounting costs, because we're actually taking, there's a force that we need to take, keep not wanting to say accounts because that's our whole distinction here. But we're considering this force, that we're considering this opportunity cost.
Well, I think like one key is actually like people who want to commit to thinking about um, competition and thinking about opportunity costs. One easy way to do this is to focus um, on time. Because if you think about it, like if I'm like, it's maybe it's easier for me because I live in a small college town, but like businesses that you think would function on reputation, the people who run those businesses are generally at like events, like like community events. They're there. Um, Now, sometimes they advertise at these events, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're just there, talking to people, meeting people, getting to know people. Why do you do that? Well, you're establishing a reputation, right? Like you're demonstrating that that like the community is important to you and that you want to meet people in the community and stuff like that. Well, that's not going to show up on their balance sheet, but it is gonna but it is an opportunity cost. Like, I mean, they could be doing lots of other things instead of meeting with strangers, and talking to them about their favorite cause or something, and so but I
But it
think
is
if
going
you
to show up.
yeah.
It is going to show up. It's going to show up on the revenue side,
Well,
right?
yeah. I mean, it's not going to show up on the cost side. Yeah.
Yeah. So the fact that it's going to, this is kind of a separate issue of how much you can explain a particular firm versus like trends in the industry. But there's going to be something out there that we could trace back to this blob called opportunity costs, right? It seems like people earn returns that are not just paying the accounting costs, and they can consistently do it. And so there's got to be something, right? And how else do you explain that except for, well, there's there's one is just, oh, it's a monopoly rent something, and that may be true, but the other is that, oh, there's some transactions cost, there's some opportunity costs that we're not taking account of, uh, that explains this return.
Well, and I think emphasizing time too helps you think um, about the nature of exchange. So you think about these papers um, by people like Barzell who are talking about um, like allocating resources through waiting, right? So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes people are just waiting in line for stuff. And like, how does that work as a mechanism? And how
Mm-hmm.
can we use the tools of an economist to think about how these resources are likely to be allocated when the way that they're allocated is, through like waiting in a line or something like that.
Yeah.
But that has broader implications because like once you start thinking about it like that, you see that everywhere, right? So if
Mm-hmm.
there is a price ceiling and there's a shortage of a good, like to me, like this is another like stark difference is that in a typical principles book, what you'll do is you'll talk about price controls and you talk about a price ceiling, and they'll say, oh well, the price ceiling results in a shortage, and then there's like there's like this little list of things that it's like, oh well, because there's a shortage, these are potential like allocation issues, and they'll have like a list, and it'll be like black market activity lines, like these are like alternatives to prices or something, but there's no time spent on that in the book. It's
Yeah.
just kind of like a list of alternatives. And the thing is that, the price theoretic approach says, oh, okay, there's a shortage. Well, let's say we allocate this by having people wait in line. Now let's think about how the allocation, um, of this good is going to change
Mm-hmm.
by moving from allocating by price to allocating by time. And also it's going to get into something like I know that you like to talk about, which Soul always talks about, which is like what's the next thing, right? So you say, okay, well they're going to allocate by time, and then you describe, okay, well this is how people are going to behave, but then that forces you to think, okay, but wait a minute, they're going to behave somewhat strategically, right? And they're going to compete on time, right? So they're going to, businesses are going to be like, well, wait a second, all these people are waiting in line. We're not really benefiting from that. What if we could figure out how to get those people um, you know, to consume our product instead of our competitor's product or something like that. And so they're trying to capture some of the value that's being wasted, kind of by people just standing in line, giving up their
Yeah.
time, and their time
Yeah.
isn't being paid to anybody.
I think that's a and segues into my next one, which is called everything's in equilibrium, but this is exactly that sole point of like, then what? How does it respond? Okay, yeah, let's suppose there's a price control, so it's imposed. Okay, then there's a shortage, and that's where the standard books ends. But then what? Well, a little bit of economic reasoning will get us. Well, then let's suppose it's housing. There's a rent control. Well, the owners are going to respond. Well, how are they going to respond? They're going to invest less in upkeep. Okay, so then what does that do? Well, that shifts down the value of this rental property, and markets have to clear eventually, right? To say that markets don't clear is to kind of throw your hands up and say, well, we don't know what happens, right? Oh, there's a shortage, therefore markets don't clear. I like the Lucas approach that that's not an answer, that you need to say the markets are clearing all the time. It's a question of how they clear. One is that time, they're clearing by something besides price. The other is quality changes so that markets clear eventually. And that there's not just that there could be all these different margins, although that is true. There are all these different margins. There's time, there's quality, there's pairing with other goods type of thing. But that there is some sort of logic, there's some sort of distinction maybe between the short run and the long run. That we'd expect certain things are going to change in the short run. Certain mechanisms are going to be used in the short run to allocate goods. Particularly lines are an easy one. It doesn't take any. Suppose you're a restaurant that has all of a sudden a surge in demand. You just have a line. Doesn't really show up on your books. You don't really think too much about it. Well, over time, you're going to try to find other mechanisms. Some of it is to capture that value. Some of it is just it's possible to do. You can, in the short run, you can't build a bigger. Today I can't build a bigger restaurant, but longer term I can, or I can have a second branch or something. That there's the margins of adjustment. This then what type of analysis. It's not just anything could happen. There are particular ones that make more sense in the short run versus the long run.
Yeah, and I think this is something that that focus on equilibrium is a focus on looking for the right mechanism, right? If you're saying the market doesn't clear, well, what you're really saying is that this thing that I'm focusing on is not going to adjust to make sure that supply equals demand, right? But something is adjusting, right? Yeah. Something is determining who gets what. And so if you're focused on that, it really forces you to think through this and to think through the various different margins that people are adjusting on and that people are competing on, right? I mean, this actually ties together all of the things that we've got to talk about, right? It's the opportunity cost, it's competition, right? It's exchange. It's all of these things are kind of critical for thinking about how we end up with the allocations that we end up with.
Yeah, and also going back to transactions costs and things like reputation. Okay, so you see a line, you see a line accumulating where things are being allocated by time, and it seems to persist. So one reaction from the economists is, "Oh, that's just wasteful. Why don't you raise prices?" I have that reaction every time I can't find parking. I get irritated. Raise prices, but you also see it not on parking, where we kind of imagine that people don't have an incentive to internalize things and they're going to set prices that way. But you see that at restaurants, you see lines at restaurants all the time. Okay. Why don't firms raise price? Why don't the restaurants raise prices? Well, there must be some other margin in which they're competing, that may not taken account of. Some of it is creates buzz. There's something about being at a lively restaurant that's fun, and there's tons of papers on that. Becker's got a paper on that. But there are also things like, okay, not all. Sometimes. So, Josh, you wrote one on this, and I think I piggybacked. Think about a natural disaster. Natural disaster strikes. Firms don't raise prices. part of that could be they're worried about anti-price gouging laws, but it seems like they could get away with more prices without being prosecuted, right? It seems like there's something else going on. Well, maybe it's they want to have a reliable price. They want, they customers want some sort of reliability. They don't want to have no clue what's going to happen with the price. And so part of your pricing strategy is not just today, it is, keeping prices. Maybe it's not even just gas, maybe it's all sorts of prices, keeping them relatively stable relative to kind of this kind of spot market trading on the Chicago Board of Exchange or whatever it's called. There's a different margin in which you're competing when you have a gas station. It's a different thing than the spot market for crude oil.
Well, I think this is also something. So, like Charlie Hickson mentioned this to me one time, and I will confess that, like, when he first said it, I don't think I fully understood what he was saying. But what he was talking about is like when you like Alshin would always like to have everything that we're measuring sort of as the same type of variable, right? So you don't want to have like a cost measured like with respect to time and then have a cost that's measured irrespective of time, like, because how do you relate those things? And so
what's an example of where you messed that up?
Well, I guess the thing that like I didn't understand is like, why is this important at all, right? And I think like the restaurant example is a prime example because there's a difference between like the cost at a given moment in time and the cost over time. So, and what I mean by that is if we think about this, one of the reasons that restaurants will let people line up, right, is that if you, like, let's say you want a steak. I have an idea of like how good your steak is and how much I should pay for a good steak, right? And so if I am going to pay a different price for that steak, depending on how many other people show up to eat the steak at the same time, this makes it a lot harder for me to plan, right? Like, how do I know if I really want to go to this restaurant if like I might pay, $40 for a steak or I might pay $100 for a steak, right? Like this is, and I think like that's one of the big things that, if we think about this entirely in terms of supply and demand, it's a very sort of static model, right? And so we're thinking entirely in terms of, like these like flow measures of costs and things like that. And the idea here is actually what matters is sort of like the present discounted value of costs, right? If you have a restaurant that makes it very difficult for me to plan, you're increasing the present discounted value of my costs, right? Because now it's more costly for me to figure out whether I even want to go there or not, and so that's going to reduce my willingness to pay, right? So since it's harder, then this sort of thing matters. And so if you're thinking about this from the perspective of the firm, like, you want to clear demand, right? But at the same time, what you really care about is the present discounted value of that demand, right? If something I do today is going to allow me to increase my profit today, but is going to cost me customers down the road, then maybe that's not something that I want to really do.
Yeah. I think that's an important one, and that ties back to the reputation point. That it's not just customers today. I need to think about customers today versus tomorrow, and the present value is a way to incorporate that, which is a nice thing that, Elchin's paper on costs. It's all in terms of like the present value of the firm is how you imagine it. Let me push back a little bit on that though. I don't like going to the restaurant and not knowing how much I'm going to pay, but I also don't like not knowing how long I'm going to wait, right? It can be very costly if I have a half-hour window or I have an hour window, and all of a sudden it's, I don't get my steak in time. I miss a meeting. That could be very costly. Why is it uncertainty? I completely grant that uncertainty is costly. but they could guarantee that I'm going to get in and out in 30 minutes if price moves around. No.
So I think this is I think that
You don't need an answer off the top of your head. You're not a business owner here, but this is
right, but I think that this is no, I think this is an important point, but I also think like this gets back to your point about equilibrium outcomes, right? So like sort of what you're deciding on is you're sort of simultaneously deciding on like what the monetary price is to charge and and also what that implies about the expected time commitment that people are going to face, right? Because if I choose, like, if I have like the best ribeye in town, and I'm charging like $25 for the ribeye, there's going to be a long wait for the ribeye. If I'm charging $70, there's not going to be a long wait, right?
Yeah.
And so part of that is what you are kind of, I mean, part of that is sort of like simultaneously determined, right? I mean, there's an old, Russ Roberts told the story about, when he, when he sat down with like Earl Thompson for lunch, right? And like Earl asked him something like, why is there such a big markup on like restaurant food, right? Like, why do I pay so much more for a steak at a restaurant than than I do like just buying it from the butcher? And it's like, well, part of that is the opportunity cost of like your, you don't have to make it, right? Like, but his point is like the cost of making the steak really isn't that high compared to some of these markups. And his point is like the markup is high because like you're taking up space, right? They've got like, 20 tables or something. Yeah. And so you're going to be sitting at that table, and the amount of time you spend at that table is kind of, preventing somebody else from sitting at that table. And so you're going to charge these people for the time that they're taking up and the table that they're taking up. And I think that all of these things are sort of simultaneously determined, and I think that's what makes it. But I think that's what makes like this whole question interesting. Like, why is this the equilibrium that we've ended up in, right? Like, because we can imagine these other equilibria.
So what are we thinking? Another aspect that that makes the restaurant an industry interesting, and it relates to your idea of time, is to what extent is it a cost or a benefit, right? When I have a short time frame, I generally think of the time in the restaurant as a cost. If I'm on a date, the time in the restaurant is a benefit, right? You're spending more time. That's part of the experience, right? Kevin Murphy says, we shouldn't think the restaurant industry is about nutrition. It's about the experience, which requires time, right? Yes, from the restaurant's point of view, your time is a cost, but it's also part of the value that they're generating. And so there's I think an underappreciated, the use of time is something that is, myself included, underappreciated in these markets. And I should really go back to Becker's paper on waiting to start thinking more about that. So I got one more that I wanted to talk about, and maybe we can wrap it up a little bit after that. I want to talk a little bit price theory. Price is in the name. I think prices are central to everything within price theory, and I think in the role of prices in coordinating behavior is something that, while other approaches, textbooks play lip service to it, I think it's really something that is really emphasized and central to price theory. What do I mean by that? I mean that David Friedman poses it as, there's the insurmountable task of deciding who gets what, and there's two options. One is the obvious one, command and control type of thing. One is the non-obvious one, but it's the one that works. Let everyone decide their own little problem, and then allow prices to adjust to coordinate behavior. And that could be a normative thing. You could say that prices do a good job. I think the more important thing for price theory is that it does a job. It does, the prices move, prices affect behavior, and not just in the market that we're interested in, across markets. Okay, that when I demand more, I buy up more stakes, that means that there's going to be, there's going to be more demand for land. There's going to be more demand for feed. That's going to prices are going to kind of carry along all of these behavior in such a way that, in a way that we can trace out. And this is tied it back to that everything's in equilibrium. Then what? That there's this chain of causation that we can start to reason through.
Yeah, and I think that for me, like, I don't know. This is how I know that I've been an economics professor for a long time, because people always, I think the older that they get, the more appreciation they have for this. But like Hayek's use of knowledge in society, when you read this as like an undergrad or a grad student, a lot of it just seems like self-evident, right? Like you read it and you're like, yeah, this is like supply and demand. This is how supply and demand works, right? And like the older that you get and the more you go back to that, and things like souls, like knowledge and decisions, right? You get these themes about prices, and that force you to really think about it, because like sometimes the argument that you seem to be getting about like why prices work is that prices are sort of aggregating a bunch of information, right? There's all this stuff going on. Nobody could possibly know about this. And so, but it doesn't matter because we have the price, and the price, communicates that information. But then at the same time, you've got these arguments that are like, well, prices are substitutes for information, right? And it seems like a version of the same argument, right? It seems like, people don't know things, and so like the prices communicate, things that, and so it substitutes for this knowledge. And, but if you think carefully about that, like, some part of that makes sense, but some part of that seems like contradictory, right? If it's aggregating the information, like how is it not communicating the information? And I think like that's something that, once you start thinking about that, like, it's one of these things where you just kind of go back to it all the time and you think a little bit more about it. But I think that's also one of the appeals of price theory, is because fundamentally that's what price theory is all about, right?
Yeah.
Like why do these prices matter, and why do we get the prices that we get, and what is what's the meaning of all of this, right?
Yeah. get a little deep there. Yeah. No, I think that it's right that it's and it goes back to points about why is this the equilibrium? Why is this the outcome? We don't. There's one perspective in which you could replace all these prices, yet no economy does replace them. So what are they conveying? And so there's a reason that we just pulled up you have a newsletter, Prices Information. I have one, Institutions Have Knowledge. We have a variety of that keep touching on this importance of the relationship between information and prices. Now, before we finish it up, I wanted to end on your last one, which I think is important about models. So where do models fit into price theory?
Yeah, so I think for me, this is also kind of a little bit of a conundrum, because I think price theory, and you'll hear lots of people say this, is that price theory uses simple models. But I think the reason I say this is like slightly a conundrum is that, like, I think this is true, but I think that what we call simple models, there's actually a lot more depth to them than we think. But I think this gets back to how we teach them, right? Like there's a very simplistic way to teach supply and demand. There's a very simplistic way to teach like monopoly. And I think one of the insights of price theory is that if we take these models seriously and we push on them and we pull on them and we do things with them and kind of, apply different insights to them, we can actually take these models like a really long way. Like they can explain a lot of what we want, even though it seems like a really simple model, there's a lot of content there, and it takes us pretty far.
Yeah, I think there are two parts to that come to mind. One, Stephen Landsberg's Armchair Economist, he starts off with this story of, he was a grad student and there was a list of things that 10 puzzles that economists can't explain. One of them I can remember is like, why is the Coke in the vending machine so much more than the Coke? And he thought at the time he had such a smart answer. It's just supply and demand. And yes, that is the answer, but it's not really the answer. And we have a newsletter on this as well, that you need to dig in. Yes, supply and demand will get you there, will help you reason through these things. But that's not, just drawing the curves. Yes, that's a simple model, but that's not it, right? That's not the answer. That's not the insight. So that's one thing that came to mind. And the other thing besides the Landsberg one is, I think of Gary Becker as a great exemplar of this. Like, at some level, the models, basically all of his models, are super simple. That the math isn't that technically difficult, okay? But it's bringing in, a different interpretation, a slightly different emphasis with these simple models that allows you to open things up. For example, Lucas has this, I think it's attributed to Lucas, this idea that, beware of theorists bearing free parameters. You don't want a model that allows you to say whatever you want, right? You can explain everything by preferences or there's so many opportunities. So I think one of the insights that we get from Becker's work is that it's okay if you have a model that has weird things happening to production, weird things happening to the market structure, and weird preferences, like let's take his book with Murphy on social economics. What's driving the result? We don't know. But what Becker is able to do is let's keep everything as standard as possible. And then let's add that people care about their social position, or people care about, the well-being of others. So let's have a simple model, but let's tweak one thing that makes it not so simple. And then we can really emphasize that. I think that has a pedagogical value that, you can teach people and explain, what's driving the result. But I think it has more generally just an explanatory value, not just outside teaching. Is you can pin down what is a better, you can pin down what you think is the cause versus this kind of hodgepodge. And maybe that biases you in the types of questions you ask. But I as a overall find that kind of approach is much more fruitful for my own thinking.
Yeah, and I think that's core to like Chicago price theory. Like, I remember being at a conference early in my career, and this prominent like macro person got up and they had this big complicated like model, and like a lot of the features of the model were like standard features you would have in any sort of like macro model, but there's just a bunch of stuff going on, and they had added like one thing to the model, and that was like the thing that they were trying to argue was important. And at a certain point, like, Lucas was there and he just like stopped the guy and was like, hey, like, there's too much going on.
Yeah.
Like, why don't you just write down like the simplest model that you can, that we would all understand, and then add this little thing to that model, and then show us what the mechanisms are. And then if you really want to use this big model for forecasting or whatever you're doing, then put it into that big model and use the model for forecasting. But those are two very different objectives. One is about, prediction, and one is about understanding. And so if we're after understanding, that big model wasn't going to help, right? But if you're after prediction, maybe it does, right?
Yeah.
And so, and I think that's like a really important insight.
The understanding can help the prediction. If you work out the mechanisms in the simple model, that can feed into the bigger model and understand when things like the Lucas critique hold and when you can actually use the predictions. But there's not quite as much of a, maybe there is, but I'm missing it. There's not the feedback the other way, in which the big complicated model then generates insights into the mechanisms.
No, and you see this, like, I see this especially like in like empirical finance. Like, people find these things, these characteristics that predict, stock returns or something like that. And to me, like that, some people see this as, oh, like this is a valuable model because it's going to help me pick stocks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I see it as the opposite. Mine, like my thing is like, yeah, this might help us predict stock returns, but the question is why, right? Like we have to understand where this is coming from, because if the reason that this thing is predicting stock returns is because like this thing is identifying like some form of risk that we haven't taken into account, it's not necessarily the case that that prediction model is good for helping you pick stocks, because you might be taking on a bunch of risk that you don't realize that you're taking, right? And so I think that starting with that simple approach and starting with understanding is important, even if your objective is just prediction, right? If I'm working at some investment bank, they just want me to tell them what model works, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I need to understand why that prediction works, and I need to understand the mechanisms, because otherwise, the prediction isn't as valuable.
I think that's absolutely right, and especially prediction about the thing with any prediction is by definition it's out of sample, but how out of sample? What does it even mean to be really out of sample versus like sort of something we've already seen? In that I think the only way is with a simple model. Of course, the reason that someone like Lucas is Lucas, the reason someone like Becker is Becker, is that they're able to do that. The rest of us have to fumble around in the dark, right? This was Peter Ireland's comment in our interview, right? Lucas could boil a model down to like 2 parameters, and one of them normalized to 1, whereas the rest of us are trying to throw together models that can have 20 different parts, because we can't do it, right? It's the economics equivalent of, sorry, I didn't write you. Sorry for the long letter, I didn't have time to write you a shorter one, right? Sorry for the complicated model, I didn't have time, or I'm not smart enough to write a simple one. And that's definitely true for research for me. But I think one of the benefits of the newsletter, one of the things I've gotten a lot of value out of, is kind of by nature of not being academic research, by nature of not being, having access to all the bells and whistles of the most complicated models, is trying to boil things down into just kind of tying your hands in a way that I think is helpful. I've gotten value out of it. Hopefully readers have gotten value out of it as well.
Well, and I think too, that's one of the values for this is like, I see the value of the newsletter as being both for the readers and the writers, because I think that communicating some of these ideas, it really helps you to organize your thoughts. And also what the readers don't see.
I'm still waiting for those organized thoughts on my end. I don't know. I don't have any yet, but
well, of course, what the readers don't see are all the ideas, that we've had that like we sort of just move on to something else because, we realize that maybe there's more here that I need to think about, or maybe there's, or maybe, I don't know how to explain this as well as I think I do, or something like that. And I think that, those are the kinds of things that are valuable, and it forces you to think in a sort of very different way. And also because we don't put math in the newsletter
most of the time.
But yeah,
I put a little bit in there. My sins will be forgiven, I hope.
But like we can't fall back on the math. Like that's because like the thing about using math is that if somebody works through the model and they see your result, this is what I tell students all the time. The math, because people will say, "Oh, I get it, but I don't get the math," and I'll say, "Well, no, then you don't get it, right? Because the math is making it simpler, right? Yeah. It's much harder to explain in words, right? Yeah. If we just write down a model, it's a lot easier to kind of get a solution and kind of say what that solution means, and sort of use the math as a crutch to kind of be like, well, see, like, yeah, it's this isn't just a random idea that I had. Like the math works out, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that forces you to think in a different way, and I think that's helpful as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a natural spot to end. I hope this was helpful for people. I think we're going to try to write up some of this in a little bit more coherent way. But I think this is a helpful kind of brainstorming activity. I think what amazed me about this conversation was just that after 2+ years of over 100+ newsletters, we keep coming back to a few of these same ideas, and you mentioned something and it triggered, oh yeah, that newsletter we talked about this, that there is something coherent that we're circling around of how to do economics. So I hope other people find that interesting. Any other thoughts before we go, Josh?
I think this was a very good sort of free-flowing conversation. I also think it's kind of a good, summary of the kind of stuff that we have done and are working on for the newsletter. So people who might not have been around since the beginning might hear this and go back to some of that older stuff and find some value there.
It was old
no
stuff.
Promises.
Yeah.
No promises.
Yeah, no promises. Well, I hope people will subscribe to the newsletter. Again, it's at pricetheory.substack.com. And if you appreciate what we're doing, think about becoming a paid subscriber. We really appreciate it. Well, thanks, everyone. Have a good one.